It was the winter of 1962 in upstate New York, and the cold had a way of settling into the bones of the house, an old colonial-style home that had belonged to our family for 3 generations. The war had ended years before, but somehow it still lingered in the chipped bricks of the fireplace, in the creaking floorboards of the upstairs hallway, in the quiet way our mother folded linens without looking anyone in the eye. I'd just returned home after over a decade of military service, most of it spent behind the Iron Curtain, working as a translator in East Berlin during the darkest years of the Cold War. It wasn't a grand homecoming, just the kind of return that comes with loss. Our father had died the week before. You, my younger brother, no longer the boy I'd left behind, had stayed. You'd built your life quietly here, running the family upholstery business in town, repairing what others discarded. I had missed everything, birthdays, holidays, even the silence that settles between people who once knew each other deeply but no longer know what to say. While sorting through Dad's belongings, you were the one who found it, the box. A small iron container tucked beneath a loose board in the floor of his bedroom closet. You thought maybe it was his, maybe something from the war, or from the years after when men carried guilt like old medals they never showed. But it was mine. You opened it anyway, and inside were 12 letters, everyone addressed to me, everyone signed with her name. You came to my room without knocking. I was sitting by the window, holding a cup of black coffee I hadn't tasted in over an hour. You stood there with the box in your hands and a look on your face I didn't recognize. Tender, almost hesitant, as if you were holding a secret too heavy to carry alone. Your voice was calm, but your eyes were red. Why didn't you ever tell me about her? I looked at you and said nothing. Not because I didn't want to answer, but because I didn't know how to explain the kind of love that survives only in silence. How do you explain a story that never had the chance to end, or a woman who was never yours in the eyes of the world, but became everything behind closed doors? That day, something shifted. For the first time, the distance between us didn't feel so permanent. Because now, you knew. Not just about Eliza, but about me. If this story moves you the way it moved me to write it, leave a like and subscribe. It helps us keep sharing stories that touch the heart, stir memory, and reveal the unexpected. And now, get ready, because what comes next will change everything. We were brothers, yes, but never truly close. Not in the way people like to imagine when they speak of family. We were raised under the same roof, shared the same dinner table, even the same narrow bedroom when we were boys, but something always felt uneven between us. Like the house was tilted ever so slightly, and I was the one who slid away. You stayed. You built a life here in this quiet New York town that never quite recovered from the war, even if no one dared to say it out loud, and I left. Called away in 1949 to serve in the military, selected for intelligence training because I could speak fluent German, and because I had the kind of face that didn't draw attention. You stayed behind with Mom and Dad, helping run the family's upholstery shop, patching the lives of others while mine was unraveling overseas, quietly, piece by piece. You became dependable, the son who showed up, the man who kept his hands busy. I was the one who disappeared, first in uniform, then behind layers of secrecy, eventually even behind my own silence. When I came home in 1962, I barely recognized the man you'd become. You had Dad's calm, methodical way of folding your hands and Mum's quiet frown when you were thinking. But your eyes had something else, something I hadn't seen before. Maybe it was disappointment, or maybe it was just a question you never asked. You didn't press me when I arrived. We ate dinner at the same table where we'd once fought over toast, but now the space between us was filled with years and with things neither of us could name. I slept in the guest room and we talked about the weather, about the old TV antenna, about the neighbors who'd moved out or passed on. We didn't talk about Berlin or Eliza or what I had lost. It had always been this way, really. Even as kids, we lived side by side but in separate worlds. You were the grounded one, fixing radios, sanding wood in the garage with Dad, learning how to re-stitch a torn armchair as if it were a wound. I was restless, always reading, always dreaming of elsewhere. Maybe that's why it was easy for me to say yes when the army came knocking. Maybe I'd been waiting for an excuse to disappear. The war had already taken so much from our parents. They never spoke of the details, but we saw it. In the way Dad would flinch at fireworks, in the way Mom kept old telegrams folded inside her Bible. They never talked about grief directly. It was just there, like the wallpaper, always present, just faded enough to ignore. That same silence bled into us. It taught us that some things were better left unsaid. So I never told you about the surveillance, about the men I translated for, about the things I witnessed in East Berlin that still haunt the back of my mind. And I never told you about her, about the one thing that kept me human through all those years, until you found the letters. That day, when you walked into my room holding that rusted box, I could feel the ground shift beneath me. You stood there, older now, your shoulders broader, your hair beginning to gray at the temples. But your voice, that voice, still had the softness of the boy I used to read stories to when the lights went out during storms. You didn't accuse me. You didn't raise your voice. You just looked at me with those steady eyes and said, "Why didn't you ever tell me about her?" And in that moment, everything I had spent a lifetime keeping buried came rushing back. The cold corridors of the Soviet sector, the feel of her hand brushing against mine in the back of the archives, the way we wrote to each other like it was the only thing keeping us alive. I wanted to tell you. I really did, but the words caught in my throat. How do you explain a love you weren't supposed to have? A love that lived in shadows, passed in folded notes and glanced across crowded rooms? How do you talk about something that ended not with a goodbye, but with silence? Instead, I asked you to read. You sat across from me and opened the first letter. I watched your hands tremble slightly as you unfolded the paper. Your lips moved silently at first, but then you began to read aloud. Her voice, through your voice, filled the room. I had forgotten what that felt like, to hear her again. You read 3 letters before pausing, and then you looked up and said, "This version of you, the one in these letters, he feels more real to me than the brother I grew up with." It broke something in me, not because you were wrong, but because you were right. You saw what I had hidden. You felt what I had felt. And in that moment, I realized something I had never admitted to myself. I didn't keep Eliza a secret out of pride. I kept her a secret because losing her broke me in a way I never fully recovered from. You didn't press me again that night, but I saw it in your eyes. You knew there was more, and there was. One letter hadn't been in the box, the one I kept closest, the one that changed everything. You kept reading letter after letter, and I just sat there silent, barely breathing, as the words I had once written, and the ones she had once written to me, were brought back to life in your voice, like ghosts we had both unknowingly invited back into the room. I watched you, your hands steady at first, then trembling slightly with each page you unfolded, and I realized how surreal it was that something I had buried so long ago, so deeply, so carefully, was now rising between us like smoke from a fire I thought I had put out forever. The first letter she ever sent me was dated March 3rd, 1950. I remember it not because I wrote the date down somewhere or kept it memorized, but because the day it arrived was the first time in months I had felt something other than tension in my chest or frost in my lungs. It had been a grey, bitter spring in East Berlin, and the apartment they'd assigned me above a bakery smelled constantly of coal and yeast, a scent that clung to my clothing long after I left. I was working as a translator then, stationed in a Soviet-controlled communications office assigned to read and convert intercepted messages, decode bureaucratic directives, and sometimes simply rewrite propaganda in cleaner, more convincing English. It was a lonely, cautious kind of work, the kind that made you question your own voice after a while. I met Eliza in a corridor of that building. Not introduced, not formally acknowledged, just noticed. She worked with one of the German departments, though what her official role was, I never really knew, and asking would have been both impolite and dangerous. All I knew was that she walked with quiet confidence, that her hair was always tied back in a way that felt unintentional but perfect, and that she carried herself like someone who had learned to move without drawing suspicion. The first time our hands touched was purely accidental. She passed me a file. I reached out too quickly, and our fingers met, but something in that moment stayed. It lingered. From then on, everything changed. We began with glances in the hallway, notes slipped into books, small phrases scribbled in the margins of shared documents, innocent on the surface, but with meanings only we understood. She once wrote, "Your silence feels more honest than most people's truth." And I carried that sentence with me for years, tucked between lines of classified reports and beneath maps of border patrol shifts. Her handwriting was elegant, deliberate, and yet urgent in a way that made every word feel like it might be her last. Over the course of 5 years, we built a relationship entirely in hiding, built not with touch or photographs or time spent together in public, but with language, with letters passed beneath layers of fear and hope. We never spent more than a few minutes together at once, always in shadowed corners of the city or quiet back rooms where the air seemed to hold its breath. And yet, those moments were more real to me than the entire official life I was pretending to live. She would tell me about her childhood in Bonn, about the poetry her mother used to read to her before she died, about how the world seemed smaller every day, and yet the space between us never stopped expanding. I would write back about America, about the trees behind our house in New York, about the way the stars looked when I was a boy lying in the backyard with you beside me, both of us too young to understand how rare peace really was. By 1955, we were both unraveling. The pressure to stay invisible was too heavy, and I had started to believe that escape was not just a fantasy, but a necessity. I told her I had a plan, a route through Prague, new names, forged documents, contacts in Vienna who could make us disappear. I gave her a date, a time, a place. The train platform in Friedrichstrasse station under the clock at noon. I told her I would wait, no matter what, and I did. For 6 hours I waited. 6. The sky turned from steel grey to charcoal black, and I stood there as people came and went, as families reunited and soldiers passed by without looking at me twice. But she never came. No letter, no message, just absence. Sharp, precise, final. I returned to my apartment and burned the second set of papers. I buried the dream with the ashes. I stopped writing after that. Not just to her, but in general. The words felt false. I accepted a transfer back to the States a few months later, returned with a box of letters, and a silence I thought would eventually fade, but it never did. I kept her letters hidden not out of shame or guilt, but because they were the only proof I had that it had all been real, that in a city designed to erase people, to silence them, to make them forget themselves, I had once been fully alive. When you opened that box, when you held those pages in your hands, I saw you touch the edges as if they might burn you. And maybe they did. Because her words were not just mine anymore, they were yours too. You read the letter about Vienna, about the escape that never happened, and you stopped halfway through. I saw your eyes fill with something I couldn't name, maybe sorrow, maybe awe, maybe something that had always been between us but never spoken. You asked if I ever heard from her again. I told you I hadn't. That was the truth I could speak in that moment. But there was another truth I hadn't yet shared. One more letter did arrive. Not right away, not in time, but it came. From Austria, a different address, a new life. Words I couldn't read until years later. I didn't put that one in the box. I kept it separate, closer, because it wasn't just her last letter. It was the only one that answered every question I never had the courage to ask. And now, all these years later, as I watch you hold the past in your hands, I know it's time to let that letter speak. Because in her words, I didn't just find her again. I found the part of myself I thought I had lost forever. When you looked at me that night, letters strewn across the desk between us. It was as if everything I'd carried inside finally surfaced, not as an accusation, but as something fragile, almost sacred. And you said words that felt like a reckoning and a lifeline all at once. You hid all of this from me, not just her, but yourself. And in that single breath, the years between us softened, because suddenly I understood that what you were really asking wasn't about betrayal, but about trust. And that the real silence wasn't just mine, it had enveloped both of us, threading through our days, unspoken and heavy. I could not deny it. I had hidden more than just letters. I had hidden a version of myself that belonged to the past, buried under years of routine, of returning home in a uniform, of performing being whole when I wasn't. And when you said, the man who wrote those letters feels more real than the man I grew up with, that cut deeper than any old wound, not because it was harsh, but because it finally named the truth. I had lost you by becoming that man, the one who lived in shadows and secrets. I asked you to sit down. We had never shared a chair so willingly. You held the envelopes in your hands, tracing their edges as though hesitant to touch what they contained, and I watched you, breathing in sync, unspoken understanding passing between us that the past could no longer drift away unaccounted for. Then in the hush of that moment I began to speak, carefully, not guarding my tone, finally letting the words I'd avoided for so long tumble into the room, unadorned and urgent, confessing that her love had been as real as anything I had ever known, fragile and bright and condemned from the start, and that I had hidden those letters not to run from shame, but to protect what remained of my heart from breaking again. I was afraid that if anyone else read them, that spark, no matter how small, would vanish, extinguished by judgment or misunderstanding. You didn't interrupt. Your gaze was steady yet soft, and it felt like the first time you were seeing me. Not the soldier I became, not the brother I stopped being, but the heart beneath. And you asked quietly, "Do you forgive yourself at least?" It was the most powerful question I had ever heard, not demanding absolution, but holding space for it. And I realized I had come this close to forgiving myself, and perhaps through you, I might begin to. Your hand found mine, and there wasn't guilt or pity, only connection, quiet redemption. And as our hands unclasped, you took up the stack of letters and began sorting them, not by date, but by the weight they carried, placing them between us like bricks, forming a new bridge, one built of memory, not silence. You looked at me and said, almost in a whisper, "We'll face it together now." And no grand gesture, no emotional crescendo, just a promise, plain and sturdy. And I nodded, and something loosened inside me, a release I didn't know I had been waiting for all these years. And then came the unspoken question, hovering between us. The last letter, the one I never showed, the reply from her in Austria years later, the words from another life, waiting in my desk drawer. You asked, nearly too softly to be heard, "Will you let me read it?" And in that request I recognized that this was not just about that letter, but about us reclaiming the story I thought I had lost. So I reached for it, handing it to you with trembling fingers, because this letter wasn't just her words. It was the moment we both finally began to heal, and it starts now. I didn't speak when I handed you the envelope. My hands were steady, but my chest felt hollow, as though the air had thinned around us, and all the words I had never said were crowding the silence. The letter had lived in my desk drawer for years, tucked inside the back cover of a leather-bound volume of Rilke's poetry, wrapped in wax paper, folded twice over. I had read it only once, the day it arrived, and then never again. I didn't burn it, I didn't frame it, I just couldn't look at it, and yet I couldn't let it go. You looked at me, waiting for permission, though I had already given it. You slid your finger under the edge of the envelope, careful not to tear the paper, and you opened it slowly, as if the letter might vanish if handled too quickly. The handwriting was unmistakable, hers, slanted slightly to the right, the ink faded but still strong, each curve deliberate, as though she had written with her whole body leaning into each sentence. You began to read, and in her voice, through your voice, everything came back. My love, I don't know if this letter will find you. I don't even know if it's right to write at all. But I've held these words inside me for so long, and if I don't send them now, I fear they'll dissolve inside me like sugar in boiling water. They took me without warning. One day I was walking to the post office, thinking about you, about the scarf you left on the windowsill, about the way you said my name when no one was listening. And the next, I was on a train with no windows, escorted by men who didn't look me in the eye. I wasn't arrested, I wasn't threatened, but I was erased, quietly, completely. My father arranged the transfer. Austria. Safe, clean, quiet Austria. I'm married now. I suppose I should say it plainly. He's kind, stable, the kind of man who doesn't ask too many questions and doesn't expect too many answers. But he doesn't know me. Not really. Because there are parts of me that were never his to claim. They were yours, still are. Sometimes I hear music that reminds me of that tiny radio we used to tune just past the Soviet broadcasts, searching for something that didn't feel censored. I still dream of your hands, of the weight of your coat wrapped around me, of the rain in Berlin that never seemed to stop but somehow made us feel more alive. I've tried to forget you, I really have, but there are memories that do not fade. They root themselves in the body, behind the ribs, in the palms of your hands, in the corners of your mouth. You taught me how to be brave in a world that taught us to be silent. You made me believe in a love that wasn't supposed to survive. And even though we didn't escape, even though I never came to that platform, I need you to know I was there, just not in the way you expected. I stood across the street and watched you wait. I saw you check your watch. I saw the hope drain from your face. I couldn't move. I couldn't come to you. I'm so sorry. I didn't send this letter to guilt you or to reopen something we both buried. I sent it because I needed you to know. I never stopped loving you, and I never gave that love away to anyone else. Not really. If you're reading this, it means I was brave enough to send it. It means I still believe in us in some quiet, impossible way. Yours, always, E. When you finished reading, you held the page for a long time. Your eyes were glassy, but you didn't look at me. Not right away. Instead, you looked out the window where the evening light was turning amber, and for a moment, I wondered if you were seeing her too. Not as she was, but as she remained in my memory, standing at the edge of a platform, rain clinging to her coat, unable to cross the street, unable to speak, but still loving me from across the divide. I hadn't read those words in over 20 years, and hearing them aloud did something I hadn't expected. It didn't hurt. It didn't crush me. It freed me. Because in those lines, I saw not just the woman I had lost, but the version of myself I had buried, the one who could feel so deeply, who could write love letters with shaking hands, who once stood waiting in the cold, believing that love alone might be enough. You didn't say much, just folded the letter carefully, set it back in the envelope, and placed it beside the others in the box. Then you reached across the table, your hand covering mine, and said, "You don't have to carry this alone anymore." And I believed you. For the first time since Eliza vanished from my life, I felt like I wasn't the only one remembering her, and in some strange way that made her real again, not just in ink and paper, but in us, in the way we finally allowed the truth to live in daylight. And now that the last letter has been read, all that remains is the memory and the question of what we do with it. Because love like that never disappears. It waits for someone to find it, read it, and keep it alive. That night, after the last letter had been read and placed carefully back in the box, we didn't say much. There wasn't anything left to explain, no more secrets to protect, no more emotions to contain. The silence between us had changed. It wasn't the cold, echoing kind that had once defined our relationship, but something warmer, more sacred, like the pause after a final note in a song that lingers just a moment longer than expected, carrying everything it meant to say in the stillness it leaves behind. You stayed at the table for a while, just sitting there, your fingers tracing the edge of the metal box, as if feeling the weight of its contents all over again, but differently this time, not as mystery, not as pain, but as something understood. I watched you with a kind of quiet awe I didn't know I was capable of anymore. Because in that moment, I realized what I had been holding on to all those years wasn't just love or grief or even guilt. It was loneliness, the kind that burrows deep into your ribs and convinces you that your story is too heavy to share, too strange to be believed, too broken to be healed. But you believed me, and maybe more than that, you stood beside me in it. Since that night, I haven't written another letter, not because I have nothing more to say, but because I no longer need to write it in hiding. I speak when I need to. I remember without fear. I still think of Eliza, almost daily in quiet ways, in the scent of cold air before snow, in the hum of a radio slipping between stations, in the way ink dries unevenly on old paper. She lives in those small moments now, not in grief, but in memory. And you became the keeper of that memory, not just for me, but for what it meant. You didn't just hear my story, you carried it forward. The box is with you now, on your bookshelf, beside photographs of our parents, beside a pair of cufflinks Dad wore only once, beside a note Mom wrote in a birthday card she never sent. I like knowing it's there. I like knowing it's safe, that one day maybe someone else will open it, not out of curiosity but out of love, because some stories are not meant to be solved, they're meant to be held. What I've learned in all these years of silence and waiting and finally speaking is that love doesn't vanish, not really. It changes shape, it outlives the moment. It becomes part of the fabric we pass on, quietly, bravely, unspoken, until the right person is ready to listen. And when they do, when they find the letters and take the time to read them, they won't just find her, they'll find me. If this story moved you the way it moved me to live it, leave a like and subscribe. We share true stories like this every day, stories of love, memory, and the unexpected ways we find our way back to each other.